like to introduce now Peter Takáč over here. He's a philosopher, publicist, and author. He studied philosophy in Nitra and completed his doctoral studies at Charles University here in Prague. In his work, he focuses on social and environmental issues, the problem of ideology, and the philosophy of Slavoj Žižek. He's the author of the books. I translated the titles, so I hope they're quite fitting. Žižek and the Others, Ideology in the Post-Ideological Age, and Only Some Weak and Savers, Essays on Marxism and Marxists, as well as co-author of publications on poverty, social insecurity, and neoliberalism in the 21st century in Slovakia, as well as a forthcoming publication on fascism in contemporary European politics. Furthermore, Peter Takáč writes commentaries and essays on several Slovak and Czech newspapers. And today he will enrich the panel on ideology with a talk on the real of the fantasy. Welcome.
Thank you for the introduction. Seems that this works. I just want to say a couple of words. The beginning that when I arrived to that building and met with Nico for the first time personally, and he was polite and says that, how was your trip? Everything went wrong, and I said, yeah, everything went wrong as usual. So this was a nice slip of tongue. And he said also with the conference, most things went wrong probably. So I was just this means that for me this means that you don't have to have huge expectations because everything that will go wrong. And second thing that when I experienced last time that psychoanalysis works was during this lunch I had with my family, and one of the persons, I don't want to name her or him, ordered peppermint tea, which is in Czech matový čaj. And I asked the person, so you still support the Slovak politician Matovič? And she or he said with an embarrassment that, yeah, I think I still support him. And I asked her, you know why I know this? Because you told me you ordered matový čaj, and his name is Matovič. In psychoanalysis, it means that also what is repressed speaks, and you can hear that in the speech. That what was repressed is being spoken, or you can hear that on the outside, what we think about and what we talk about or so on. So my presentation won't be so exhausting in a good manner as Jack's was. Probably I needed to come back to Žižek. And this will be probably just a brief overview of some of Žižek concepts, which hopefully will be interesting, at least just a little bit. So in the first part, in case you fall asleep or so on, so I will be speaking, or you realize you have better things to do. In the first part, I wanted to talk about the role of, or what is specific for Žižek, what is his role as an intellectual, and in the second part, I will try to think about, I'll tell you how I think about where do we find ourselves in relation to the Lacan's four discourses as Žižek thinks about them in our present era. So I will also read it, so it is maybe understandable and better. So let's begin. John Gray called Žižek a brilliant and witty pastichist of the highest order. Pastiche is like a parody, is a kind of imitation, but without that mocking element. So you don't laugh. So Žižek is some kind of pastichist, some kind of imitationist, according to John Gray. When reading him, we encounter a multitude of unexpected and witty observations, counterintuitive twists, and theoretical insights. However, more experienced readers may be struck by a feeling of déjà vu. Haven't I read this somewhere before? Didn't Marx, Adorno, Benjamin, as he's a German thinker was, James and Derrida, Lacan, and others say something similar? So is there anything new in what he says? To be fair, it should be first noted that Žižek admits to this repetition. With regard to Lacan's 4 discourses, he describes himself as a hysteric, someone who undermines the power of the master, the figure who brings authoritative truths in order to arrive at new insights. For the reader, however, Žižek acts as an analyst, a figure somewhere between an intellectual and a spiritual leader, confronting the reader with their desire, which he reveals to them. We can ask, as an analyst, what I think Žižek does. Do you feel dissatisfied with this culture of capitalism? And do you have the courage to change it? Isn't it just showing off in front of the big others, your friends or professors at the academy? Thus turning them into a divided subjects, faced with the question of whether they really want what they desire. If Žižek, in agreement with Lacan, claims that the big other does not exist unless we ourselves help to create it, it follows that Žižek himself is not the big other. This is probably why there is so much misunderstanding about what he is actually calling for, whether revolutionary engagement, distancing oneself from the events, if the options offered to us are indistinguishable from one another, or demanding a third option, some kind of third option. Rex Butler pointed out to the importance of the master signifier in Žižek's political, philosophical readings and interventions. Each of Žižek's commentaries, books, or lectures is a variation, a demonstration of this key concept, variation of the master signifier, on the basis of which the problem can be viewed from a different perspective, from which everything takes on a completely different meaning if we look at a matter from the point of view determined by another key concept, binding the fabric of the text with different stitches or sutures. Alongside this exchange of meanings, he also points to the absence, the lack of a starting point of analysis, whether in the psychological or political sphere. No perspective is complete or exhaustive, so it requires the help of illusion, fantasy, to lend it an impression of completeness and integrity. After all, a true philosophical materialist has no other option. As soon as we establish a certain concept as decisive or fundamental, like labor, capital, proletariat, technology, and so on, we essentialize and fetishize it, i.e., we remove it from its social contexts and influences. We artificially model reality and overlook its openness and changeability. If human rights are to be our starting point, they can be defined in various ways. The right to work was guaranteed even in the Auschwitz concentration camp, but not the right to life or freedom of movement. The right to housing can be assured by Chinese authoritarian capitalism, but not the right to assembly or freedom of speech. These are guaranteed by the Western liberal capitalism, but at the expense of the aforementioned rights. Frederick Jameson came up with dialectical criticism, an approach according to which every concept we use for criticism must be open to criticism from another position. Ian Buchanan describes this method as follows. Dialectical criticism sets itself apart from other kinds of criticism by the determinate way in which it develops a critique of its own concepts and categories at the same time as it deploys them. At its fullest, this means reckoning the position of the observer into the analysis and taking into account the very self-consciousness of the thinker. Lacanian Marxist criticism and discursive analysis involve a constant cycle and exchange of discursive positions with regard to the criticism we perform. Criticism becomes incessant, sometimes as from the perspective of the communist ideal, holding up a critical mirror to liberal capitalism as an unfulfilled utopia and aspiration for equality and freedom for all people. Otherwise, it means B, from the perspective of insufficient productivity limited to the production relations of private ownership of the means of production, or C, excessive productivity caused by the accumulation of capital at the expense of the destruction of the planet, or D, criticism of the alienation of labor destroying the creative potential of the worker, or E, criticism of how entrepreneurs of workers are consumed by work, etc. Criticism does not mean praising the system for what it has accomplished and done, but what it has not done, or what price has been paid for it, what sacrifices have been made on the altar to fulfill a virtual and ultimately unattainable goal. But doesn't every original philosopher engage in such a new reading of philosophy and other discourses? And is it even possible to be original in the postmodern era, especially if Žižek adheres to the Lacanian Hegelian premise of the constant presence of the big other in our lives? What we are born and live in pre-assigned structural roles and meanings? For Žižek, being original means, at best, being a good copy. A copy that combines and reverses what we know intimately, customs, trends, references, inside out. By freely manipulating cultural heritage, we resemble a museum visitor wearing a traditional costume, which can either lend dignity to the wearer or conversely ridicule and caricature them, emphasizing their negative traits. Let us just recall Marx's description of Napoleon Bonaparte's nephew, who took his place on the throne thanks to the insignia, the identifying symbols of the predecessor's social status. However, we can still find comical and tragic imitators of leaders today. On the one hand, we have businessmen like Silvio Berlusconi and Donald Trump, whose imitation of statesmen comes across as farcical. Their rule was accompanied by scandals and abuse of power. On the other, we have Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, who became a statesman commanding a country defending itself against Russia on the basis of the popularity of the TV satire Servant of the People, in which he played the president. The contrast between imitation and reality in relation to Russia's aggressive war was also noted by journalist Peter Pomerantsev, who remarked that in Ukraine, the values of freedom, sovereignty, patriotism, and civil society, which are the subject of superficial debates in the West, on an abstract level, have become a reality, part of everyday life and survival. So what has comedian Zelensky offer voters who gave him 31% in the first round and 73% in the second round of the 2019 elections? A decade after the financial crisis, a feeling has spread among the population of the Western world that, to paraphrase Freud, could be called uneasiness in cynicism, oder auf Deutsch Unbehagen in Zynismus. A feeling of betrayal that politicians do not represent the interests of values of voters and that they are all the same as a political class. Therefore, they longed for a world where professional politicians do not rule, but ordinary people or someone like them. They were looking for someone who has something that others do not have, or as France Gall sings in her song about Ella, Ella, c'est je ne sais quoi que d'autres n'ont pas. They wanted to move from the Lacanian psychoanalysis, what Lacanian psychoanalysis calls the big other, grand author, established political movements and parties like conservatives, liberals, social democrats, which set the limits of politically possible reality to the little other, que d'autres n'est pas, the elusive object of politics that has been pushed out of social reality, set in the framework of what is considered possible. So they wanted to move from the big other to the small other. When they operated within the limits of neoliberalism, they asked questions such as, why did we lose our homes and jobs? Why did social services have to be cut back financially, and why did we have to make do with less when the banks were being bailed out? Why did inequality reach such incomparable proportions, and so on? I could not skip that, and so on. And they were offered fictitious or fantasy explanations, such as, we lived beyond our means, there is nothing else we can do, the system must be kept running. An attempt to overcome these ideas, or as Žižek says, to traverse through fantasy, filling the void left by the lack of a personalized narrative, came with the Occupy Wall Street protests. The traversing through fantasy could be expressed in the words of Black Sabbath's song. This came to my mind because the leader deceased a couple of weeks ago. Black Sabbath song's Heaven and Hell. The closer you get to the meaning, the sooner you'll know that you're dreaming. Protesters gathered in the squares of large cities to see that the illusion they had clung to and followed for years was indeed just an illusion, because in this realization they were suddenly not alone. They were somehow building a new big other, which it seems failed. However, the process was not complete because, as Žižek describes, excuse me, they expressed an authentic rage that remains unable to transform itself into even a minimal positive program for social political change. They expressed a spirit of revolt without revolution. End of quote. Their vague desire produced crowds of populist politicians who dressed, behaved and spoke like supposed ordinary people. Almost everyone who entered politics began to speak openly and indiscriminately indiscriminately about what they heard voters say in polls, often contradicting themselves and above all, cursing the previous elites on behalf of the imaginary people for whom they nominated themselves as spokespersons. Due to its popularity and the lack of alternative radical politics, there has been and continues to be a struggle for position between, in Gramsci's terminology, old traditional intellectuals and the new organic intellectuals. Today, the conflict pits the old establishment of the Democratic and Republican parties in the US and the discredited Social Democrats and conservative liberal right in the EU on one side against Trumpist populists and more recently maybe also democratic socialists on the other. Due to their inability to change the political reality, dissatisfied people in Greece, Spain, UK, and so on have found a new master. Their vaguely formulated demands ironically led to a new trend of replacing ordinary politicians with governments of depoliticized technocrats, a trend that echoes Jacques Lacan's warning to the revolutionaries of 1968. What you aspire to is a new master, you will get one, which was followed by the rise of the discourse of the university, i.e. the government of experts, bureaucrats, and bankers. The shades of ideologically colored political parties were replaced by gray experts who are neither right-wing nor left-wing, but proceed according to, so to speak, neutral post-ideological recommendations. This time, as the definition of the discourse of university says, the illusion lies in the impression that there is no power interest behind expert management, but that the leadership is open and lenient towards everyone equally. In reality, however, this trend is leading to the control of society through a permanent state of emergency and the suspension of political democracy. This is also a quote I found in Žižek's Year of Dreaming Dangerously. We saw this in the efforts of the Troika, European Commission, European Central Bank, and International Monetary Fund to force Greece to repay its national debt, and in Orban's rule by decree. Populism and technocracy are two alternatives, two ways of managing a crisis which must be rejected. Populists try to seduce voters with anti-immigration propaganda, being outwardly hostile also against the EU and NATO, in order to unite a divided nation under a common name. Technocrats want to lead the state under the banner of independent decision-making, free from subjective interests. The first could be responded by the modifying Christian commandment, love thy neighbor, to love thy colleague. That is, by accepting someone who we do not choose, with whom we must share a common space, and whose presence may even be unpleasantly traumatic for us. If we rid ourselves of idealistic illusions about others, we will be forced to confront their real. They may be, for example, alcoholics, perpetrators of domestic violence, supporters of patriarchy, homophobes, and so on. According to Žižek, loving others means something different than desiring what they desire. It means accepting that the other's desire is different from my own. Instead of exploring and approaching it, it requires keeping a distance from it, maybe ignoring it. That is why one of the common tactics of the far right to gain sympathizers is to expose different cultural life in its specific forms and provoke resistance to it. Like they could say, they do this and that at home. Would you like to have it here too? The defense against technocracy is to demand political scrutiny of proposed solutions and their politicization. Technocracy leads to micropolitics, the division of political ideological issues into the smallest particular decisions, which results in the absence of debate about the broader framework in which these steps are taken and which causes the problems. However, the problem is not only with right-wing populism, but also with left-wing populism. Then it is really a long text. As Žižek points out, the systemic flaws of capitalism are identified here with its most visible manifestations: bankers, financial manipulators, the ultra-rich. Confrontation with the fundamental contradiction that produces these anomalies is postponed indefinitely. Left-wing populists want the current capitalist system, not a different one, without its symptoms, such as corruption, failure, and crisis, which is temporarily possible. Later, however, it is necessary always to confront the system that produces them. So how should we confront it? According to Žižek, we should perceive Lacan's four discourses of capitalism, Lacan's discourse of capitalism, as a combination of all four discourses: master, historic, analyst, and university. Capitalism primarily fulfills the fiction of the master discourse. It represents the final horizon or funnel into which all known meanings flow. Like, it's all about money, it's all about profit. However, the form of its domination is hidden. Individuals are formerly equal and free, and dominance has shifted to the relationship between things, commodities, like people sell their labor on the market as a commodity, the surplus value of which is appropriated by its buyers, capitalists. Given its indirect nature, domination manifests itself in two ways: through the rule of experts, the 1968 revolt, and afterwards, questioning established authority, and at the same time this creates new leadership, new masters, and new subjects, i.e. cycle of direct and indirect forms of domination and resistance to them. Žižek concludes from this situation that in order to stop the production of new knowledge and pleasure that can be commodified and keep the system running, the different kind of master or leader is needed. This requires an authority that would interrupt the subject's fascination with new objects and thus stop the cycle of desire that feeds capitalism. This process must be preceded by a discourse of analysis, which distinguishes two dimensions of, this is just the last sentences, two dimensions of the concept of objet petit a, used by Lacan. Not only the fascinating element that stimulates our desire, but also the emptiness that this object fills. Breaking the spell of capitalist desire means recognizing that behind what attracts us in commodity, there is emptiness, and therefore we do not need it. Thank you.